Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today on this is our third Thursday virtual program series. My name is Lauren Burnham, and I'm the Assistant Director here at the American Swedish Historical Museum in Philadelphia. We're thrilled to bring you this year-long series of virtual tours to mark the museum's 100th anniversary. Our goal is to provide virtual learning opportunities to celebrate the centennial with our long-distance community. Today's talk will explore the historic origin of modern Scandinavia. A few housekeeping things before we get started. Today's lecture is being recorded and will be made available on the American Swedish Historical Museum's YouTube channel in the coming week. We ask that everyone please keep yourself on mute just to minimize any background noise. And we invite you to ask any questions that you have. You can type them in the chat and we'll read them aloud at the end for Jorgen. And if you would, we will also have a time and invite people to unmute if you would like to ask your question live. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Jorgen Flood, our today's talk host. Jorgen is a member of several Scandinavian organizations, both nationally and based here in Philadelphia. He served in the Norwegian Army, has an accounting degree from the University of Oslo, and an MBA from the University of Wisconsin. History is both a hobby and a passion for him. Jorgen is a longtime writer of magazine articles and published his first historical fiction book, To Live and Die in 1030, in 2008. As of today, he has published 9 historical and three historical fiction books. So with that, Jorgen, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you. Thank you so much for joining us and providing this talk today.
Thank you, and nice to see so many people are interested in Scandinavian history. I won't talk too much about what Scandinavia is, because most of you, of course, have some Scandinavian background, so I don't think that's really necessary. But I would talk a little bit about the history of Scandinavia. When you talk to people who are not from Scandinavia, and you talk about what's happened in Scandinavia, you basically hear a lot about the Vikings. Then the Black Death came, and it was quiet for 600-700 years, and then World War II happened. So what I've been doing in my historical books is to concentrate on that period in between the Viking Age and the modern Scandinavia. So let me just start with Scandinavia as such, and we could go to the first slide. Okay. So the second slide, sorry. Yeah. So this is the Scandinavian map, which I'm sure all of you recognize right away. And it shows the one to the right. Let me just get my, okay. So the map to the right shows all the changes that has happened. You know, there's this so-called boring period, and of course, for many people in many countries, Scandinavian history is boring because nothing happened, supposedly. But the reality was very, very different. After the Viking Age and after the Black Death, and of course, the Black Death was the big schism in European history. We went sort of from old, it was in part of the early Middle Ages, but to a certain extent, it defined the period or the break, because until then, it had been this Mediterranean empires, big empires, reorganized, and that fell down around 500, and Scandinavia sort of drifted into itself. There was not too many, there were, of course, traders, etc. But Scandinavia was very quiet, and it was partly because the Black Death hit Scandinavia very, very hard, and especially Norway and Sweden and what is today Finland. And for the simple reason that it also coincided with something we call the small ice age. It was the climate was changing, and that started before the the Black Death period, which was 1350, as I'm sure most of you know. And it meant that the Scandinavian peninsula, and again, I'm not talking so much about Denmark because they, of course, have a very big marketing and they're further south than Norway and Sweden. But that meant that the thousands of farms were abandoned because they were high up in the mountains, and as it cooled, that's the first ones that had left. So the towns or the cities, whatever we want to call them, started to depopulate. And first they grew, but then the Black Death, of course, because the conditions in those days were pretty bad health-wise. And when you get more and more people into towns and let's call it cities. There were not many cities back in Scandinavia at that time. But so the moment the Black Death hit, it hit Norway and Sweden really hard. It was poor nutrition. Of course, the standards of cleanliness back in those days are incredible when you read about it today. In movies, it looks very nice and neat, but most of us wouldn't last long, I think, in that kind of a society. So the period after that left a big power vacuum. It was Norway, which was a kingdom, sort of ended up with all these small valleys and this and that. There's towns. Even when I was a child, actually, or just before I was born, before planes became usual, there were towns and valleys in Norway that were pretty much closed off all winter. Of course, you could get there with big effort, but it wasn't like today, you can travel all over the time. So they could be closed, and that also created other problems. So Norway and Sweden and Denmark were pretty much rudderless, and then something happened, which was basically or following the fact that the royal families in all three countries more or less died out. And it ended up in one royal family, and it was Queen in the beginning, Queen Margaret. She was basically administering probably the biggest country at least in Europe at that time, because it included Greenland also. So Greenland, Finland, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and some of the Baltic republics, which before they were conquered by Russia, was also part of it. This lasted for a while, but there was still a feeling in the rest of Scandinavia, or in most of Scandinavia, that the king wasn't really their king. He was sitting in Sweden in a small town, and there was a long distance from that place to, let's say, Finland or to northern Norway or to Iceland. And of course, the kings in those days were not always the most peaceful guys. So it ended up, and I'm not going to go into details here, but it ended up with a bloodbath in Stockholm, which was basically a massacre. It was probably exaggerated a little bit in history, but anyway, it was. And so Sweden broke away, and then you had Norway and Denmark being in one joint kingdom, and then Sweden, as I said, Sweden in the other. And that was the beginning of what, when we look back at it, almost like a 500-year war. In Norwegian history, we say that this, and this is from the Norwegian perspective, this period was called the 400-year night, because around from 1590, 1600 to 1905, we were first a part of Denmark, or a junior partner of Denmark, and then from 1814 to 1905, we were part of Sweden. And in that whole period, as I said, it was almost continuous warfare. There were, of course, peaceful period, but when you look back at it from today's vantage point, it looks almost like a continuous war. And in fact, Scandinavia was some of the most militarized countries in the world, actually, whatever the world was in those days. I guess it was very Europe-centrified at that stage. But anyway, so at least our history. So that's So that was anything but a boring period, but of course it was a very difficult period for a lot of people in the town, especially the ones who were forced to fight. And in those days, that were the farmers. So that's, and when you look at it, after fighting for 400 years, more or less, the changes weren't all that bad. I mean, they just basically ended up with a more realistic map. In Sweden, parts of Denmark was in, well, what in today is Sweden, but that broke loose. So Sweden got some of those areas. They got a part of Norway. At one stage, they had a very large part of Norway, but then there was a couple of more battles, and they lost that part. So that's why when you look at the right-hand map, it shows that you can see all the different colors indicate where these the areas that changed ownership. The one to the left basically shows how big Scandinavia is, and Scandinavia is a very large area, and even without Greenland, because if you take the largest countries in Europe, you have well, I guess Ukraine is then let's leave that to the side for now. But apart from Russia, which is obviously much bigger, if you look at the biggest countries in area, the biggest is France. The second largest is Spain, and then the next three is Sweden, Finland, and Norway. So from the 5 countries, I guess it would be 6 now in the Ukraine. 3 of them are in Scandinavia. Of course, if you combine them, and not even mention if you throw in Greenland, but even without them, just that plus the Norwegian islands of Spitsbergen and Iceland, we would have been by far the biggest country in Europe, and with a fairly small population compared to the others. Because all in all, Scandinavia has about 25 million people in very round numbers, and it's easy to remember because it's about 10, probably more like 12 now, 12 million in Sweden, and then 5+ million in Denmark, Finland, and Norway. So the 3 of them have fairly similar population. Okay, so if we go to the next slide, this was the situation before the Black Death. People were very religious. There were ancient traditions. You had the Lord who could do pretty much whatever he wanted. You have a priest or priests, which many of them, of course, just supported and lived off the Lord, and people accepted, I think, to a much higher degree than we all would today. So I just took in this an old medieval picture, but it's probably very true of what existed back then, because it was difficult times. I don't think they saw it as difficult because it was normal for them, but for us looking back, it was would have been, as I said, very difficult period. Next slide. So I'm not going to read all this, but this is, from what I understand, this will be on the website if I'm right. So this just talks about that history, and it's one thing I mentioned is COVID. Now the COVID had a very small, by historic standards, a fairly limited death rate, because it's terrible for those who did. But compared to the historical narratives like the Black Death, which we say today is usually between 1/4 and 1/3 of the population died out. And when we saw the disruptions that happened with COVID, which was surprisingly, I think for most of us, was surprisingly large. You can only imagine if that death rate had been 25% of the population. So society stopped, and after that, everything started to change, because once society started getting out of the plague, and of course there were smaller plagues following up, I think both the clergy and the lords and everybody else had lost their power. Not completely, they were still very powerful, but they were not as powerful as they had been. And of course the priest had always said, sickness was God's punishment and stuff, which we wouldn't exactly agree to today. But that became difficult after the Black Death because they died as quick as everybody else. So, all right, let's go to the next. And very chances that we have about half an hour. Let me see. So these two pictures are I put them in because they shows what that world we left behind, so to say, was happening. This illustrates that the guy to the right, he's at the bathroom because most houses didn't have indoor, and many of them didn't even have outdoor. They just had a set in the wall, as to say. At the same time, the building to the left is the cathedral in Trondheim, Nidaros, which is started building in around 1100. So even though the majority of the population had a very very poor existence, it's hard to say it. As I said, they wouldn't see it that way. But at the same time, as they built these houses and outdoors, they could also create and did create in Scandinavia and other places fantastic cathedrals and buildings. So this was just a little illustration of that. And then the next one, next slide, yeah. So this is just another explanation or indication of the Black Death, and it changed all the art also, because after that art you see so much about disease and so on, and it's very easy to understand. I think we all understand a little bit more about what it might have meant today than we did before COVID. Very different circumstance in every direction, but it has something. You kind of can feel what if it had been something like Black Death. So it was an enormous change in society. Now, after that, as I said, there were hundreds of years of fighting. Let me see. Go to the next slide. Actually, you can jump to the next one. This is more. And after this, around 1500, there was a number of military battles in Scandinavia, and to go through all of them would be very time-consuming, to say the least. But as a sort of a very general comment, is to say that by and large, but there were exceptions. Denmark, Norway tended to win the sea battles, and the Swedish army tended to win most of the land battles. And it's not so strange because, of course, Norway and Denmark were both Atlantic coasts, which means you had to build, sturdy ship. They were much more, especially Norway, was much more dependent on trade than either Sweden or Denmark. And the reason is, of course, the majority of what was produced in those days were food, 70-80% at least, and probably more in many places, of the population were farmers. And farming in Norway can be tough, especially if it's a cold summer, which of course happened many times, and starvation. So they also had to do a lot of fishing. And of course, fishing became a very big industry in Norway, and actually still is. Just 6-7 years ago, fishing was when the oil price was dropping quite a bit. The fishing industry brought in more money to Norway than oil. So Norway isn't all oil, but you often. So these ships are one, of course, is to the left. That's a ship burning, as you see, and that's from one of these sea battles. And the one to the right is actually the last sailing frigate in the Norwegian Navy, which was sunk was actually sunk by the British Navy, not the Swedish Navy. Okay, we can go to the next one. So what happened over these years was, of course, that these three kingdoms, which had been kingdoms, even though it should be said that before, during the Viking Age, it wasn't so much a country as a kingdom, but it was always one of the local kings was more powerful than the others. So there was one king of Norway, but at the same time there was a lot of very wealthy earls, as they call them, and that changed after the Viking Age and after the blood the pandemic. Sorry, lost my train of thought here. So I just want to mention something about that. And after that, the kings become more and more powerful. And then in around 1600s, one of the Danish kings declared that, like the French king also said, the state is me. So absolutism is what we call it. And that's very much what I mentioned about here. And as I said, you can read these things afterwards. And actually, all of this is based on a book I wrote, which is about a lot of illustrations. Some of them are used here, and then talking about this. I call my book "The Wars for Scandinavian Supremacy" because that's essentially what it was. So everybody wanted to be a king of Scandinavia. One of the reasons nobody managed to win in this period is that every time one power, whether it was Sweden or Denmark, tended to get an upper hand, the major powers in Europe, and over this period it was basically four. Russia came later, but in the beginning it was basically France and England and Holland. And Holland, of course, was a big sailing power. So whenever they saw somebody getting an upper hand, they got a little bit nervous. And one of the reasons was that the biggest, apart from fish, which Norway exported, and food, most of the, or a very large percentage of the fleet was busy transporting timber. And the reason is these boats that we just looked at, of course, as you all know, they were made out of timber. So you need a lot of big trees, and Scandinavia had big and strong trees. Those the more southern trees are not usable really for shipbuilding because you need very hard timber, and that became a big export. And when Norway started to sort of come out of its, started to recognize itself again, the first ones who really made big money were called the timber barons, because Norway and Sweden both have big forests, and Sweden, of course, had one problem, and that was that to ship the timber out, they had to go through the strait between Denmark and Sweden, which could be easily blocked by others. It's a little bit like what we see in Hormuz now. Even if you if you don't have to fight on the other shore, your guns could basically close the strait. So it's not a new thing to try to force to pass small narrow waters. It's very difficult if the enemy sits on the other side. Okay. The other thing was, of course, that during this period, industrialization started. And it was the Industrial Revolution, as we talked about, which is we usually go around 1700. But it was other things also. And Norway became more industrialized than Denmark. And the reason was that, as I said, farming in Norway it's not easy, and it's a small percent. I think it's something like 5 to 10%, or it's less than 10% of the land is actually farmable at all. But then you had the timbers, and then you also had water power, hydropower, and hydropower, of course, was one of the things that made Norway modern. And we today people have a tendency of think, and I apologize if I talk more about Norway than Sweden and Denmark, but I am from Norway, so I know more about it. But hydropower was for saws, for example. So that is something Norway had was hydropower, and that became so it was industrialized from that side. The other thing was that Norway was always a more egalitarian society and in a way freer society. than both Sweden and at least southern Sweden and Denmark. And the reason, of course, is that you have hundreds, if not thousands, of valleys in Norway. There's 50,000 islands around Norway. 2,000 of them were inhabited, probably maybe more now if you count summer houses, etc. And even back then, Scandinavia, none of the Scandinavian countries had large populations compared to Europe. They were all much smaller than it is today, of course. But to keep your farmers in check, which basically made it impossible for them to protest or anything like that, that would be fairly easy if you have big open fields. You gather a few hundred knights, and terrible name for basically soldiers, but so be it. And you could carol them, and of course that happened also in several instances. In Norway, if you have a valley with 400 people, you don't, to start stationing soldiers all around this area would be incredibly expensive. So obviously that wasn't done, which meant that people had to govern themselves, and that's what happened. And if the king came, even that was difficult because it's a small place and people would escape up in the mountains. And during there's an episode called The Scottish Train, which is kind of illustrative of that. There was another one of the many wars between Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. The Swedish king had rented 300 Scottish knights, or soldiers, basically soldiers, and they were coming over to join his forces. And some some person who obviously had no experience from Scandinavia found out that the easiest way would go through Norway. So they landed, and then they were going to march across to Norway. Now, marching across in those days, there were very few bus routes. The internet was awful, and trains had not been invented yet. So marching up through narrow valleys in a place where temperatures can change very fast, and with a hostile population, it ended like you can imagine. And the farmers who decided to stop them, and they just manned both sides of the valley, and these poor guys from Scotland, they were basically crushed by stones and muskets, and so there are very few, if any, I don't know. Well, there must have been some, but very few losses on the Norwegian side among the farmers. But the 300 were stopped, and most of them were killed. I think it was something like 20 or 30 who managed to escape, or no, they were not escaping. They were captured and then sent to Denmark. And actually, many of them joined they were mercenaries, so they joined the Danish army instead, those who survived. So that's why Norway and Denmark and Sweden had a different attitude, so to say, among the farmers, because Norwegian farmers were used to managing themselves. There was no lord that would come, and there was, well, maybe around Oslo and a couple of places, but that's, considering the size of the country, very small. So that was what happened. And then with the Industrial Revolution and the nationalism, which came around 1700, Norway became more and more independent, and there were several starts and stops on becoming independent. And another episode, which is kind of interesting to read about. There was a war between Sweden and again Norway and Sweden at war. But of course, those wars, they were really the king's wars, literally. We talk about the king's day in another for another reason, but let's forget that for now. But in those days, that was definitely the case. So the king asked the soldiers in Norway, in a valley there, to invade Sweden. So they would pull troops from the fight between Denmark and the southern part, which was, of course, the more important. And The problem was that these were all farmers, and of course they had, and they knew the farmers on the Swedish side, because in those days it wasn't a border like it is today. You could just walk across, And of course that's what they did, and a lot of them they were basically being told to maybe kill their in-laws or uncles or whatever. So the farmers refused, and the soldiers, there was no way the officers couldn't do anything. And of course, the Danish king got mad, and that was the beginning of the Norwegian army, because he found out he couldn't trust these farmers to do exactly what he wanted. So then they imported the officers from Germany to a large extent, and started using professional soldiers. All right. The other thing was Sweden became more and more powerful over the centuries, and Denmark, of course, started losing control of Norway. It lasted till 1814, but they also there were other forces at war, of course, and one of them, which in many ways marks the end of the let's say Kalmar Union. Yeah, I forgot to mention that this union from 1392, which was before this when it broke up, but that was sort of the last time it was Scandinavia. Then it became more egalitarian, and then it became more and more per country. People started more and more to see themselves as Norwegian, as Swedes, as Danes. That took some time, but it slowly grew from that until then, as I said, especially in these more remote areas, which you find in Finland, in northern Sweden, and in Norway. They, as I said, they managed themselves, but they started to becoming Norwegian to Swedes and so on. And the last few wars was, the last one that was any big war was in 1812. That's as most of you know, that was Napoleon. And of course, during Napoleonic Wars, Denmark sided with Napoleon for quite obvious reasons. The British sent in their fleet and sunk the whole Danish-Norwegian fleet at anchor, pretty much. And then they had a problem shooting up the fleet, but what they started doing was they actually bombarded Copenhagen. So it was in any sense, in every sense, a terror bombing, or whatever you want to call it, which of course has been quite common. But Sweden became more and more powerful, and of course, with the end of the Napoleonic Wars, they were on the winning side. But just before the Napoleonic War includes Scandinavia, Russia had attacked Sweden, and they took Finland. So Finland was then a part of Russia, and then the British, who was the big power in those days, in 1812 and 14, they realized that they would have very little chance to reconquer, to declare war against Russia just to win back Finland. So they gave the Swedish government Norway as a gift, as a compensation for losing Finland. It's understandable, it's not exactly how we want to have affairs organized, but it's easy to see the reasoning from their side. So then Norway found itself part of Sweden, and that became a very opportune moment for the Norwegian population to declare independence. So the first thing they declared it, the parliament was convened. They didn't have the power to maintain it, so they ended up in a Swedish union, and it was called the Dual Kingdom. So Norway had a much more independent size. That we had a common king and common foreign policy, but Norway, in most other places, actually governed itself. So the parliament was there, but the feeling in the Norwegian population at that time, and in 1700s, nationalism was on everybody's lips. So that carried on into the 18th century and the 19th century. And eventually in 1905, they declared in full independence. And fortunately, the Swedish government and the Swedish king was a lot smarter than a lot of rulers today. They knew that they understood very quickly that if there became a war, that would probably set things back 100 years in Scandinavia. Because things were after 1812, all the wars with in Scandinavia, they were not Scandinavian wars. As we ended up on opposite sides. But after that, Norway and Sweden, Denmark became very friendly. So, so there's this Swedish government said, "All right, goodbye." And after that, of course, we had the three kingdoms in Scandinavia. Now, today, when we talk about what is Scandinavia, Scandinavia, in a very strict sense, Scandinavia is the Scandinavian peninsula, which is Norway and Sweden. But even from way back, when you talk about Scandinavia, you talk about Norway, Sweden, Denmark. I think today, when we talk about Scandinavia, when I'm back, it kind of, strictly speaking, the three countries. But I think today it's also something which we previously called the Nordic area. But I think the Nordic area and the Scandinavian area are kind of merging in people's mind. It will take some years, but the Scandinavia today, it's become very organized in the sense that Finland is part of Scandinavia now. The Baltic republics, Iceland, Greenland, that's a little bit different, yes, but everybody knows everything about Greenland these days. And I think it's a very good development. And the latest thing, which hasn't gotten that much press here, but one of the latest developments is, of course, that the Scandinavian militaries are now being integrated, and the air forces are pretty organized already. A fighter, in modern times, fighter planes are always in control. Have control with in communication with ground control. So the radar stations and this and that, and a guy flying a fighter jet up in northern Finland could be being controlled from a radar station in Norway or Sweden or Denmark or Finland, wherever. So that's being integrated. I think that's a good solution for Scandinavia also. Apart from those things, so that's a Scandinavian initiative, of course. On the economic front, it's a little bit different because we're all part of what is the European Union, except Norway and Iceland. So, but both Norway and Iceland, especially Norway, is very integrated in the European Union. And Scandinavia has a lot to bring because, as I said, one is a big country. I mentioned fighter planes. If you combine the four air forces, they actually have more fighter planes than any of the other countries in Europe. So, but individually, of course, they're smaller. The other thing, which just to mention about what the modern Scandinavia is, it's also a very rich area, a very diverse industry, and also, of course, with Denmark, Sweden have excellent farming areas. The forestry is big, fishing is big. There's also nobody can avoid talking about rare earth metals today. And there's actually been two enormous fields discovered in Scandinavia. One is in the Finnish-Swedish border, very close to where the Malmbanan is. For those of you who, the Kiruna mines. If there are any questions, you can just direct them to me afterwards. And then another one in southern Norway. And they both expect to have very large deposits of some of the most hidden metals and also the seabed. And of course, Norway in particular has an enormous continental shelf. So I think it's going to be a very big. They all. Let me step back 1 minute. Um, if you look at the economic side, until the turn of the century, and I'm not talking about the 20th century, but the 19th century, before World War II, Scandinavia was fairly poor, not as poor as so often imagined, but it was a poor area. And of course, that was until World War One was when you had the big emigration, especially from Norway, um, and probably had something to do with the collapse of the farming economy because, as I said, Norway doesn't have much farmland. So, but after that, things started changing very fast. And I often hear as a Norwegian that, oh yeah, but Norway wasn't very wealthy, or sometimes say, oh, it was poor before oil. But that's not true. That's when I grew up in the 60s and 70s, I'm giving away my age here. Um, Not to mention the 50s, which I also remember. Um, the I traveled a lot because my dad, he had been in the Air Force, I mentioned, and then he ended up his last 20 years flying for Scandinavian Airlines. And so I traveled a lot compared to almost all my friends back in those days because, people didn't have that much to travel. It was, for the wealthy everywhere, really. Um, and I never felt going to the US or England or any of these countries that the only thing I remember from my first trip to the United States, which was in 1960, was one. I mean, it was California, so we went to Disneyland, which was pretty exciting. Uh, and the other thing was that the only thing I noticed, and we visited some family, was that the cars were bigger. There were more cars, of course, but I didn't really react about that. But the cars were big because that was when you had this yeah, big everything in those days. Now, of course, European and Asian and American cars with that are more or less the same size. Actually, they just put different nameplates on them. Um, so I really feel that the, the the new Scandinavia emerged in the 20th century. And after World War II, of course, there was a little rebuilding, but there was also some big benefits because we did. Sweden, of course, had avoided the war, so their industry was intact. Uh, Denmark didn't really have much fighting, and Norway had some fighting, but most of it was in northern Norway, and that period lasted till 1960 in Norway. In 1960 until 1960, there were rules for what you could import because they had to rebuild, especially the northern part of Norway. And so but then in 1960, all the restrictions disappeared. So um, I was lucky because my dad, since he was at that stage, he was a reserve officer in the Air Force. He was allowed to buy a car, or he was given a permit to buy a car. So people had the money; they just limited the number of cars that they wanted to bring in. All right. Um, so this was a little um, excursion through Scandinavian history. And I think this was about the time that Laurie gave me. I'm first. It was great to see so many people show up, and um, hopefully you learned something from Scandinavian history. Yeah. Anyway, thank you
Yeah.
for coming, and if there are any questions.
Yeah, thank you so, so much, Jorgen. That was incredibly in depth and gave us a really wonderful insight into a very long period of history that often I think is overlooked. So we're extremely happy to take questions now. If you'd like to type them into chat, I don't see any right now. If you prefer to unmute and ask a question live, now is the time to do so. So yeah, please step forward. I think you were too thorough, Jorgen.
Well,
You,
covering 500 years in 30 minutes is it's also a challenge.
absolutely. People are thanking you for an interesting lecture.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. All right. Well, if there are no questions, then we are happy to. Oh, someone says, please mention your book if you'd like to let people know what your books are,
Yeah.
Jorgen, and where they can maybe get them.
Um, yeah, you can send out my address, I think. You can send it to Jorgen Flood. It's it's well, let me first give I have
Do you want to
a
put your email
website. Yeah.
address? Yeah,
I
you
have
can
a
provide your email address, Jorgen, and people can email you directly.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's Jorgen, my first name, Jorgen, 00 at AOL.com. And I also have a website. So it's www.jfloodbooks in one word. And then you have the different books. Nine of them are from history. One of them is actually about train. I've always been sort of a big train fan. But the others, three of them are Scandinavian, and the last five or six are very Norwegian. I have to admit that. But
Mhm.
I have one about as I said, called the uh, Wars for Scandinavian History. I'll show you one so I can.
I think he'll be right back.
Yeah, sorry.
That's okay. Jorgen, if you can hear me, there was another question in chat, which is why and when did the languages diverge?
The old, well, the Old Norse, which is actually very much what they still speak at Scandinavia, at Iceland. So the others have been then Danish, Norwegian, and Swedish have diverged. I don't know too much about that particular sequence, but I think in Norway, it's you can point in one thing, and that's that um, as a Norwegian, when I talk to somebody from Sweden, we would talk in our own languages. That's usually fairly easy. Maybe some words you will ask for, but whenever I talk to a Swedish person, I almost always, well, not here because most of them, of course, then English might be better. But yeah, in Sweden, you speak Norwegian and you speak Swedish together. That's harder with Danish because the
Hmm.
pronunciation is so difficult.
Right.
But when it comes to reading a book, it's the opposite. As when I used to be a very big reader, not quite as much today as some years ago, but um, Danish books I would just buy in Danish because they're so similar, and that has to do with that the first uh, the first universities go back, a few hundred years. It's not 1,000 years like you see in Greece or Rome and things like that. But the Danish king was very aware that he wanted to keep Norway, so he did not allow Norway to have its own university. So until 1800s, whoever in Norway wanted to learn something beyond the elementary school would go to Denmark, and that influenced the writing because they, of course, were thought much more than they were.
So,
In,
Jorgen actually has a follow-up question. Someone asked, what language does the combined Scandinavian military use?
I would think they do English. Yeah.
English. Okay.
Yeah, I think so. And also, there's so many dialects in Scandinavia, and especially in a place where you have big mountains and
Hmm.
so on.
Um, okay, so we have a few more questions coming in now. Why do you think the Scandinavian countries have such a close relationship given the long history of war?
I think it was because as I mentioned about that example from the Norwegian army, the soldiers wouldn't invade Sweden because they would have been fighting against their families. I think the animosity was at the top. I don't think there was any. Of course, some people. I mean, people are people. There's for every, but I don't think there was any animosity between Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. And
Another
People,
person actually, just maybe this is kind of related to that. Somebody asked how important was famine in driving those early wars. So if you're saying there wasn't a lot of animosity, maybe it was more of a competition of resources or trying to make sure that, you had enough resources to last your village or your little group long enough so that, famine could have also been a driving factor.
it probably was at the very beginning, but
Hmm.
after that, I don't think it was too much of it. There, of course, are multiple things, but I think all in all, it was grabs for power and resource, as you say. Control the strait between Sweden and Denmark. If you could control that, of course, you could get taxes. Tax all the boats that went back and forth, and there was a lot of boats going back and forth, especially with timber, but also other things.
Hmm. Great. All right. Last call for questions because I think we're coming up right up to time. All right. Well,
Let me just show. So
oh,
you asked
somebody
about the
said
book. Yeah.
JF or Flood Books is not working. Did I type that in incorrectly? Can you tell us one more time the website for your books?
I can. I hope they worked last time. I haven't looked at it for a while, but yes, JFLOODBOO books.com or
That,
.net.
yeah,
Dot
that
net.
was, I forgot the L. That was my mistake. There you go. Oh, wait, no, that was in there. All right. Well, we can
You can
double
also
check.
have .net is
Oh,
sometimes
.net. It's
yeah.
.net. Okay. Books.
I will double check that everything. So
Okay. All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us. I would just like to wrap up by saying that we really appreciate everyone participating virtually. And if you're interested in learning more about our upcoming program or becoming an ASHM member or ways to support during our 100th anniversary, please feel free to reach out to us. Our contact information is on our website, americanswedish.org. And stay tuned for next month's third Thursday virtual program topic, which you can register for at americanswedish.org/events. Thank you all so much. And thank you, Jorgen. This has been really, really special. And we appreciate your time. And we will see you all next month. Thank you.
thank you, and I will double check my website right
Okay,
away, see if there's any
great.
problems.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks.